I wanted to create a quick video on file creation and file saving. Hopefully this will be beneficial to you if you have any questions on any of this stuff, and you can also come back to this video at any time throughout the class and use it as a reminder or reference when you are creating your projects initially, when you're saving them and exporting different file types. And this is something that we are, of course, going to be repeating with every single exercise and project in the course. So, quick reminder, I've got Photoshop open here. To create a new file, you can always go to File, New, or when you first open the software, just click this New File button on the left here. And there are a lot of presets here that you can play around with, but typically I would just create a custom file and just read the instructions for each assignment in Canvas really carefully and just make sure that you are creating a file that has the correct name, the correct width and height or size, and resolution, and in some cases background contents. This isn't typically a huge deal when creating the file. You can always change this easily later, but the most important things are going to be the size, which is the width and height, and the resolution of the file that you're creating. And then just as a reminder, you can always change the name of your file later, but for good practice, just practice naming your files with the correct naming conventions. This is part of your grade when you turn things in, so I'm going to be checking that you're naming things correctly and that you're following the instructions on Canvas. So we're always going to name all of our files art137 underscore our last name. In my case, it's Newcomb, and then underscore whatever project or exercise with that particular number. And as always, the instructions for each one are on Canvas. We're just going to pretend that we're creating a letter size document here, but you would just make sure you're following the instructions, making sure that if it specifies inches or pixels, that you're selecting those options here. Hit create, and now I have my file. And also, as another reminder, if you need to start placing JPEG images that you've downloaded, either from something like Unsplash or Pexels, or even from your personal camera or phone, it's typically best just to go to File and then Place Embedded. And then find your images. I'm just going to grab one from Exercise 1 and place them here and resize accordingly. And you can hit return or enter on your keyboard to place the image. You can also open up your Finder window, or on PC it's File Explorer, and you can click and drag images into Photoshop this way. So either way works, but something that I want everyone to be mindful of is with almost every project and exercise in this class, you are going to initially go to File, New to create a new document. And then what you're going to see when you open Photoshop or when you've created that new document is something that looks somewhat like this. Typically, we're going to be using transparent backgrounds. So again, there's going to be some exercises where we're going to be opening an image directly, but for the majority of our assignments, you're going to be creating this document, and it's called an artboard. So what you see here, this blank rectangle on my screen that's 8.5 inches wide by 11 inches tall, that's my artboard. And from there, I'm going to be placing images and different files, graphics, in some cases painting within this file. So this file is going to be customizable by me, and it's what's called a .psd file. So this is what we're typically going to be creating for every single assignment. I've noticed that some people do not have the correct file dimensions, and I think that could be due to people opening images directly in Photoshop. So we want to avoid that unless the instructions tell you specifically to do that. So the way to do that, I'll just show you. So this is kind of what not to do, is you're clicking and dragging a file into Photoshop like this. And you can see, if I kind of center this, you can see in the file that I initially created, I have some space here on the top and bottom, and that's because I've created a custom letter-sized file, which is what I want for my project. On the right here, the image takes over the entire artboard, and you can see that the layer specifies background and it's locked, that's what your file is going to look like if you open a JPEG or other image file directly in Photoshop. So we don't want this. You want to always be creating a new file by going to File, New. So just be really mindful of that. And I also wanted to go over how to kind of fix that if you did open your JPEG image directly in Photoshop and now you don't have the correct image size. And you can always just kind of double check that you have the right size by going to either image size or canvas size. Both will work here. Typically, I like to use canvas size. So you can go to image canvas size and you can see this is the correct size. So you can always change it. Say you've accidentally made your canvas or artboard only 8 inches wide. You can just add a 0.5 to add that 1/2 inch. It's not going to show anything here because I already had the correct size, but let's just cut it off just to see. So let's just change this to 6 inches. It is going to clip some of the image that we have here, which is fine. This is just an example. So say your file looks something like this, you know it's the wrong size. You can always go to image, canvas size, and then we're just going to make sure that the width is 8.5 inches. Hit OK, and you can see that now it's giving me the correct width. It just widened the artboard or the canvas. Now, say you've been working on a file that is, probably better if it's too large and you want to make it smaller. You can resize your overall file by going to image and then image size. So say this file was only supposed to be 1,000 pixels wide, or you can always change this to inches if you need to, depending on the project. This is also where you can change resolution, but it's very important to note that you can always downsize your resolution easily, because resolution is the number of little tiny squares that make up our overall image. So a high resolution image is going to have 300 pixels per square inch. A web-sized or low resolution image will have 72 pixels per inch. And it's a lot easier for Photoshop to reduce the resolution rather than add more pixels and increase the resolution. So if there is an issue and you need to increase the resolution, you can go ahead and try that, but it is likely going to affect the quality of your image, and it might make your image look grainy or what we call pixelated. So keep that in mind. That's why creating that new file with the correct resolution is very, very important, because we don't want to be messing around with resolution later. But you do have this option just in case you need to and it's getting to the last minute. So we can reduce the overall image size, and what that's going to do is reduce both the size of the artboard and the size of the image and all the layers within it. If you want to just change the size of the artboard, then once again, you would just go to image canvas size. So keep in mind, that's the difference between image size and canvas size. Okay, next thing I wanted to talk about or sort of remind you of is all of our different save options and export options. So as you edit your PSD file, always make sure that when you initially start working on that PSD file, so after you've done that file new, you've started adding some layers, make sure within the first, say, 5 minutes, you go ahead and save that file. And if this hasn't been saved anywhere on the computer yet, you can just go to File, Save, and Photoshop will prompt you to save to the Creative Cloud. And another reminder, for most of you, most of my in-class students, I have been telling you not to use Creative Cloud just because of our kind of strange YC Cloud, Creative Cloud access. Creative Cloud does not work properly for us. But if you are an online student or you have a personal Creative Cloud account, feel free to use this if you're comfortable with it. But just make sure that your files stay organized and you know where everything's located. It's not an excuse to get an extension on a turn-in if you can't locate your files. That's up to you to stay organized. But for most of you, and just for good computer practicing, computer file organization hygiene, you're going to want to click on this on your computer button that I'm hovering over right now. So for the most part, I'm going to be avoiding Creative Cloud in my instruction, but if you do know how to use it, once again, if you have a personal Creative Cloud account, you can use this. But I'm going to hit on your computer, and I'm just going to, because I've been organizing my files under Art 137, Module 1. I mean, really, this doesn't matter. I'll go to the main folder and I will just go down to the bottom here. Sorry, I usually use the shortcut, but I'll just hit this new folder button at the bottom. On PC, I think there's an icon at the bottom or at the top to create new folders. So you can always create new folders as you're saving things from Photoshop as well. It's a little bit harder to edit, but you can always go back into your Finder or File Explorer and edit folders and document names later. So I'm just going to call this saving demo. And then because I've already created those naming conventions when I created this new file, it's automatically applying that here at the top where it says save as. And you can see it's defaulting to a PSD file. I just want to note this as well. You always want to save a PSD file initially. For almost every single turn-in, you will need to turn in a PSD file. And that's obviously a very important reason, but the other important reason for this is this is your only editable copy. So once you start exporting things into a JPEG, you can no longer edit them. That's when you want your file to be somewhat finalized before turn-in. So if you want to keep editing your file, you want to make sure that you always initially save this PSD file. And that should be default as we get into other projects. If you have a really large file, sometimes Photoshop will force you to save a large document format, which will save it, I believe it's a PSB instead of PSD. So that's fine too. If you want to let me know about that or if you have any questions, feel free to message me. But for the most part, you will just have this Photoshop file. So make sure that you save that initial Photoshop file. And then when you have it open in Photoshop and you look at the name of the file here where I'm hovering, it should say .psd. So we always want to make sure to save our .psd file first. I'm just making a couple of changes to my file, and you can see that once I start changing my file and making edits, where it shows the name of the file up at the top where I'm currently hovering, Photoshop will show this little asterisk star icon. So that just emphasizes that your file is currently unsaved. So for good practice, get used to using the shortcut for this. So you can always go to File, Save, or you can also just hit Command Save on your computer. So I'm going to hit Command Save, and oops, I accidentally hit Close at the same time. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to make a few more changes just to show you that again. You can see that little asterisk is appearing, and I'm hitting Command Save on my computer just to make sure that I keep saving that PSD file. So that's something you want to do maybe every few minutes. Just get really used to using that shortcut on your computer. And always do a save before you do any exporting to other file types such as JPEGs. And to go over that once again, we already went over File, Save a Copy in our first exercise. That's just a nice quick way to save something as a JPEG. So that's something that you can definitely do to save a higher res JPEG. The annoying thing is that Photoshop will add the word copy at the end of your file name, and if you're saving it as a JPEG instead of a Photoshop file, you probably want to just remove that word. So this probably won't be the way of saving that we're going to be doing for the future, but this is something that you can do, and just be mindful, especially if you need to duplicate and save a copy of the PSD file. You know, say you wanted to try another version of something, this would be a very quick and easy way to do that. So I will just save that copy there. And then it will show you this. If you want to keep that JPEG pretty high res, pretty high quality, you would want this little toggle thing to be all the way at the right where it says large file, and then 2.3 megabytes or M there, that's just previewing the final size of your file. So we're going to hit OK. And another way to export or save a high-res copy of your file, which this is probably the typical way we will use going forward, is going to File, Export, and then Export As. And Export As just gives us some more options. So for the most part, you'll want to focus on this area on the right. For the majority of our assignments, we're going to be exporting files to JPEGs. There might be one or two cases where we're going to export to PNG or GIF. Those are other file types, and it's important to note that JPEGs do not have transparent backgrounds. So if something is transparent, seen in my Photoshop document here, you can see when I export it to a JPEG, it's going to default to white. And that's fine. This is the typical way that we would export images for websites and the typical way that we'll be exporting for this class. But if you do need a transparent background for any reason, you would want to start to get familiar with PNG file types. But for the most part, for the purposes of this class, we'll use JPEG. You can kind of play around with the quality of the JPEG, and you can see it might not make a huge difference here, but as I bring this all the way to the left, it just sort of reduces the quality of the image a little bit. This is something that's okay for web JPEGs because they don't need to be as high quality or high resolution, but if you want a high resolution image, you typically want to leave this on high. And in this case, we're not going to be messing around with the image size too much. We're going to be doing that in how we save images for web. But we're going to go ahead and just export. So this is for the high-res JPEG. So we selected JPEG, and we just made sure that the quality is all the way at high. Then we hit export, and just make sure that you are saving this in a place that's easily located, that makes sense to you. And in the case where we're turning in high-res images, we're typically going to keep those same naming conventions and then just add an underscore high-res typed like that and hit save. The next way that we will be turning in JPEGs, and this one we might even do more commonly than high-res. For pretty much every assignment I can think of, there will be a low-res web turn-in, and this is the smallest file size that we're typically turning in specifically for our discussion boards on Canvas. So this is where I'm asking you to resize those images so that they display nicely in our discussion boards. So for this, you would go to File, again, back to Export, and then Save for Web in parentheses Legacy. So File, Export, Save for Web. It's going to look somewhat similar, but it has even more options. But we're just going to focus on a few of the options here. So let's see. You could start with JPEG high. You have a lot of options here. So high, low, medium, those are just the quality options for the JPEG. So these are different presets. So just always make sure that this says JPEG high, medium, low, and that this says JPEG. And quality, for the most part, you could put it at least 60 or above. And you can see the quality will change as you kind of mess around with this. So kind of feel free to play around with this toggle and see how things change. This will be more important with larger images because this image is fairly simple. Changing the quality isn't going to make a huge difference here. And just make sure that optimized is checked there. Just kind of match your screen to mine. I did talk about how we typically don't want to increase the size of an image, but I'm going to do it just for this example because for exporting our web JPEGs, we are typically going to be downsizing them to 1920 pixels on their longest edge. So in this case, the longest edge is the height. So you would just change that to 1920 and it will always automatically change the width unless you mess around with this. So don't touch this toggle, just leave that as is and make sure that when you change the longest edge to 1920 pixels, that the other either width or height also changes. So for most of your images, they will be 1484 by 1920, or if they're a landscape format, then the width would be 1920, the height would be 1484. And that's really all you're gonna do for exporting to web for this class. And another thing to note is you can always preview the estimated size that the file will export to on the left. You can see it says JPEG 430.5K, that's kilobytes. just make sure that your web JPEGs are at about 2 megs or less, 2 megabytes or less. For the most part, they should be under 1 megabyte. So the smaller they are, the quicker they will upload and be viewed on Canvas. So after you make those changes, you will just hit save and save this wherever you're saving files for that particular project. And for those web-sized JPEGs that we're going to be saving a lot of, you will always add an underscore web, just like that, and hit save. And now if I go to Finder and go into that folder that I created, I have all of those JPEGs as well as that PSD file saved. And also just want to mention, some of you have asked me, why do I need to save so many file types? I should just be able to turn in my PSD. And yes, that would make sense that you would only have one thing to turn in. But we want to practice exporting and saving multiple file types because that's just really important in the design world. And really in any industry, if you're working with a lot of graphics in Photoshop. If, say you were printing this image in a poster or a card or, some type of flyer or something, you would typically not be printing directly from the PSD. There are some cases where you might, but typically your printer or whatever vendor you're using for that final output, they would typically ask for a JPEG or PDF or some type of other file type. Same goes for web. If you are, using some high-res images that you took and you want to upload them to a website, there are very few instances that I can think of where a website would be able to load a PSD file, because your PSD file, you can see here, is over 18 megabytes. That's pretty large, especially for the web world. Whereas this web file is 800 kilobytes, which is much, much smaller. So typically when you're uploading things to a website, you would use a JPEG, some cases a PNG or GIF image file type. So it's just really important to keep practicing exporting and saving multiple file types, because it's something that you will likely encounter in your careers, and especially if you're making graphics, flyers, different things for your small business. All right, so that's all I have for this saving tutorial. So like I mentioned, you can always come back to this for reference, and please do message me if you have any further questions.